Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the world of fat and how exciting that word really is. It's a incredibly complex world, and we have a enormous amount of important information that we have to go through. And when I said I'm going to tell you how we digest fat is, I'm going to have to put that into a second part. And I also want to leave room for discussion at the end, but that's all okay if you want to watch the recording later. So fat absorption is not trivial by any means. It's a very complex process, and I will go through it the next time in part 2. Today I'm going to talk about the world of fat in general, and that is basically the incredibly important world of all of these different compounds. And that is what we deal with when we talk about fat, mostly triglycerides. So these are important in diabetes and in energy and in our general blood work, but most of the people don't really understand what that means and how that all works. So free fatty acids, obviously, I'm going to focus on omega-3 and omega-6 because that's what we do in our world of omega-3 Success Hub. And I'm going to talk to you about lipids and membranes and cholesterol, bile acids, and then again about eicosanoids and all of the messengers. So what are the food sources for fat? I'm just double checking you can see the correct slide, food sources for fat. And if anybody doesn't see the slides advanced, please let me know. So food is incredibly laden with fat, and that is the main ingredient that we really need to ingest. I'm not saying that protein is overrated. Obviously, we need a certain amount, especially of of important amino acids that we can't make ourselves, essential amino acids. But the world of fat is far more important than protein, because no protein can really work without having proper fat, because the cell is made out of over 20 million fat molecules. And you could
that's where our founder's
you could
heart
turn
is
off
at.
your
He's very passionate
sound.
about the kind of that companies toe the line, so they can't have fingers.
So I'm going to mute a few here. Sorry about that. So basically, dairy is actually a very, very important source of fat, and it's become under the wagon for a while now. So I'm going to talk a lot about dairy actually today. And, you know, that's how humans really have survived in cold climates for the last 10, 15,000 years since we started farming. But obviously, plant oils, plant fat is very important. We now mostly consume olive and avocado. We know that all other oils are inflammatory, with the exception of coconut oil because it's saturated, and I'm going to go over that, of course, and what that all means. And then obviously we get our omega-3 from fatty cold water fish. And what does it mean to ingest nuts and seeds? What meats really are rich in omega-3, and what other fats are important? And then poultry and pork are a problem. I will talk about that. Eggs are a superfood. extremely rich in very important fats. So don't forfeit your egg yolk. Many people think they just need to eat the protein. No, the egg yolk is extremely important. So yeah, and then organ meats and many other meat products I will talk about today. So the world of fat, and please let me know if the slides don't advance. So food sources for omega-3, it's on my website and all in my book. And what I always emphasize is when you talk about these tables, you basically need to understand there is a ratio, obviously, and we know a lot of people consume flax seeds and chia seeds. They have a very low omega-6 to 3 ratio.
Need to go to school.
And I'm going to mute this person here. I should.
Hans, du hast dein Mikro aus. Please turn on your microphone. We don't hear you.
You can hear me again. Okay. Sorry about that.
Yes.
So again, I was saying that the flaxseed, chia seeds are used to ingest a very low omega-6 to 3 ratio index. However, you have to look at the absolute amounts of omega-6 you're actually intaking. So that's in this table here in my book on my website. Basically, many of plant sources have a low ratio. However, they have a very, very high absolute amount of omega-6 that you're ingesting. And walnuts are kind of famous for their low ratio, but it really isn't that low. And all nuts really are inflammatory. And there's a very, very large amount of omega-6 absolutes in walnuts. So yeah, always look at the absolute amounts. And obviously, algae oil is the winner because that's where we get our omega-3 from. That's where the fish gets it from. That's where the cow gets it from. And we can now make vegan algae oil with high amounts of EPA that is genetically engineered or influenced, basically. So this is basically the name of the game. And nuts are usually a good source of food when it comes to vegan or vegetarian food. However, the absolute amounts of omega-6 matter here too. So per 100 grams, it's a lot less than oils, of course, but it's still very high. So again, you know, walnuts have a very high omega-6 content compared to omega-3. It's really significant, 38 grams per 100 grams. And that's what you're ingesting, and that's why nuts in general are inflammatory, even though they have a, you know, fairly decent index. But pistachios, for example, are consumed a lot and they have a very, very high index. So generally, you know, you should restrict your intake of nuts if you want to avoid omega-6. So obviously the winner is cold water fish. We know that. Everybody knows that here. And the absolute top winner is mackerel. So your omega-6 to 3 index is much, much lower when you ingest cold water fish. And the fish actually have a negative index. So it goes below 1, extremely low. they don't need that much omega-6 because they live in an environment where they can survive with almost all omega-3. For us, that is definitely an issue. I'll talk about that in a second. But we know for a long time now that all Western worlds are very high in omega-6 because of, you know, the previous food tables I've shown you. And I'll show you some more about fat, about meat very soon. So basically the winner in the world is Japan at 8-1, but we only have 500 tests in our group here in our testing. I'm sure there's more, but the reason is that, you know, they eat a lot of mackerel. It has a very high fat content and it's very concentrated in EPA, DHA. It comes out of the northern oceans. And it's a very good fish to eat. I actually love it. So the rest of the world, we know that 24-1 up to 40, 50-1. India, very high. All the Asian foods now are laden with omega-6. They no longer cook with lard, they cook with inflammatory omega-6. That's why they have such high incidence. And then also, obviously, it's a matter of processed foods. So is a very low negative omega-6 to 3 ratio dangerous for us? We don't really know, but we know from our history that we're very close to 1-1. And any index below 2-1 is going to keep you safe. When it gets below 1-1, it's probably still safe. And there's sufficient data that it is safe. As long as you have some omega-6, when it gets to extreme low values, which nobody really can achieve, then obviously it may impair or immune function and clotting, etc. So, you know, again, the history of human fat distribution is such that we grew on a 1-1, close to 1-1 index. And also the calorie intake was quite different. And we were definitely in a situation where we ingested a fair amount of saturated fat, and then they stopped telling us to eat red meat and saturated fat. However, that increased significantly in the last century. So this is pretty good data. Obviously, we don't really know what the index was, but it's been well studied, and we know from Eskimos and hunters and gatherers that we can extrapolate this data. So only in the very last half of the 19th century, we started poisoning ourselves. Before that, the situation wasn't great. Ever since we've been farming 10,000 years ago, we've been ingesting more and more omega-6 and no even trans fats. That is basically toxic to us. And we have a situation now that is absolutely dire with lots of fat intake, but way too much omega-6, way too much unhealthy fat, and almost no omega-3. So yeah, I mean, this data is pretty solid, but all you need to know is that we basically came from hunters and gatherers. And if you look at venison and you look at grass-fed, grass-finished beef, then you know what we should eat. That was our staple food, the only food that's not inflammatory. However, we don't really know that that is good food anymore, because what do they do to a grass-fed cow? They still put grass-fed on the label, but the last few weeks of their lives, they get put on a feedlot and fattened up with grain. And guess what? They're losing all of their omega-3 or most of it. So in this table, you can see how grain-fed beef basically is very high in omega-6 to 3 ratio versus grass-fed 2.5 to 1. So the absolute amounts of omega-3 go up, and your omega-6 goes up and omega-3 goes down. And then when it comes to pork and poultry, which they always tell us it's much safer to eat than beef, basically it depends on what they feed them, right? So traditionally pork was fed all the scraps, vegetables, you name it. Not that much grain, certainly not that much corn. Neither were poultry. They were picking around, eating worms and insects they could find. And that situation is no longer true. So they have fairly high omega-6 to 3 ratio. And obviously, if you have access to venison, that is by far the best food. So very interesting, you know, that there's 200 milligrams of omega-3 per 100 grams serving in grass-fed beef. Somebody needs to mute their, can't tell who that is, Barbara. So basically, the 200 milligrams of omega-3 disappear when you put a cow on a feedlot. And the average conventional beef, you know, still has some omega-3, but it can go down to 0. And that's what all the studies show. So especially EPA and DHA go to 0. So the declining percentage is very, very strong. And every week matters that a cow is put on a feedlot at the end of their cycle. And so you can definitely have grain-fed beef being sold as 0% of EPA and DHA. So it's no longer in any source of omega-3. But, you know, the good news is we have our cold water fish oil that will make up for that. Also very interesting here is that CLAs and antioxidants also decrease. I'm going to talk a lot about milk here in a minute too, which is very interesting. So yeah, you have to make sure you're ingesting grass-fed, grass-finished beef, and it's very expensive. So it's really hard to offset that high omega-6 index. And a little side note here on the conjugated fatty acids here from cows that also go down when they're on a feedlot. So that's, you know, one thing that we're getting from the bacteria in the cows. Conjugated basically means that there's no spacing between the bonds here. This is your regular EPA and DHA, and there's a methyl group in there. So when it's conjugated, it's a completely different molecule, and even omega-6 conjugated has beneficial effects. And that all comes with the digestion in the cow. We cannot make those CLAs. So, you know, the domestication of grass-fed, grass-finished beef has a very beneficial effect on humans. I'm going to talk about butyric acid and so on. You know, we've been ingesting, you know, dairy products for a while now, and we basically make it anti-inflammatory with butyric acid and with the CLAs, and all of that disappears when you put it on a feedlot, right? So that's my point here. So very simple. Let's start at the beginning. What are triglycerides? They're basically glycerol, and then you link fatty acids to it. So what is a fatty acid? It's a chain of carbohydrates, basically oil, crude oil, you could call it, there's a carboxyl group at the end that reacts with the glycerol, and then you have your triglycerides put together. When these chains are saturated, meaning no double bond, they are very stiff, and that's when you get butter or you get coconut. That is definitely a very frozen cold food. When you introduce a double bond, you make oil because it becomes more liquid. You can see here the molecule is a lot more flexible, and it makes your membranes more flexible. I'll talk about that in a second. So that's basically saturated versus unsaturated. You guys know all of that. So what are short chain fatty acids? Those are basically very minimal fatty acids. So if you start out with the carboxyl group, which is just one carbon, that's not really a fatty acid. Neither is acetic acid with 2 carbons. But when you get to 3, 4, especially butyric acid, those are called short chain fatty acids, and they are very, very beneficial. There's a lot of them. This is a whole topic in itself, and basically the intestinal flora. I was saying that last time. I think that there is no such thing as a beneficial bacterial flora. They're all inflammatory, but lactobacilla and other beneficial probiotics have figured out how to produce these anti-inflammatory short chain fatty acids, and they downregulate the immune system, and so that's why they're beneficial. And their own aggressive liposaccharides basically are not effective, and the body can handle them. So yeah, and then we basically go through a cold winter, and you can get a lot more calories and fat out of a cow when you milk it than when you actually eat it. So a milk cow was far more important than anything else. Should humans still drink milk? Probably not, because we have much better sources of fat now. However, there are very beneficial ingredients in milk, and I'll get to yogurt and butter. Straight up drinking milk is not a good idea. No species drinks milk from another species. And the protein in that cow milk is highly inflammatory. And that's basically the name of the game, why we ferment it, because then you alter that protein and it's safer. But the point is that humans didn't just drink milk. We evolved with milk, and milk evolved with us, and it's a co-adaptive system. It really reshaped our genes. So, no other species can really digest lactate past a certain age. We have evolved around that, and we can now digest it. And that makes us basically able to ingest cow's milk, and it's a very important source of protein and fat if you don't have anything else available. So I'm going to talk about A1 and A2 milk. And so if you make your own yogurt, you make it from A2 milk, and it's basically the effect here that lactose, when you buy yogurt, you never know how long they fermented. There's additives in it. When you make it yourself, you can ferment it for 24 hours, and most all of the lactose is gone. So, that's also why you really don't want to drink milk, because it's mostly actually lactose sugar, it is hard to digest for everybody. But when you ferment yogurt, you basically get rid of the lactose. In 24 hours, it's pretty much gone. And that's why it's very tart, right? So most people are sensitive to the casein. It is inflammatory. So in Chinese medicine, milk is a cold, damp, inflammatory food. That's why you really have to be very careful with it. But the benefits of yogurt can be far outweighing the inflammatory casein, because you can really digest that protein pretty well. But if you have a severe IgE response, also because you're 90% omega-3 deficient, you're basically in a situation where that becomes prohibitive. So the A2 versus A1 milk is a problem of our modern cow. So when they started breeding them, dehorning them, so cows used to have a lot of big horns, African cows, right? And that's a big problem. They can hurt each other, can hurt the host. So they started breeding these Holstein black and white Friesian cows, and they mutated to this A1 type of milk where the casein is very inflammatory. It releases a peptide called beta-casomorphin 7, and it's an opioid-like peptide, which on the first run looks good, right? Because we like opioids, but unfortunately it actually slows down everything. Your digestion, constipation, bloating is the result. And it crosses the blood-brain barrier and causing autism and schizophrenia. So yes, A1 milk is what we're bombarded with. A modern cow makes 60 liters per day. Poor cow. They used to make a fraction of that, and 10% of that goes to the offspring. Feeding the calves is very important to the cow's ability to be happy and everything. So that's, it's a big problem. And so sustainable A2 milk is the solution. And again, these farmers spend a lot of money on that. And these cows don't make that much. They don't make 60 liters. And they're still giving also 10% to their calves. So that was our original milk, not our modern A1. So if you make your own yogurt, you basically try to get A2 milk and then make it yourself, or you can even buy A2 yogurt now. So what is next is medium to long chain fatty acids. So after butyric acid, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, right? So you're going from 4 to 6, 8, 10, 12. And then finally, saturated stearic acid, one of the most important fatty acids you need to ingest. It is not present in plants. You can only get stearic acid from animals or cacao. It is, not possible to eat a lot of cacao butter. So basically, it's all animal. However, coconut is still a very good source of fat, saturated fat, because it contains MCT, and these medium chain fatty acids are very good for keto diets, and so that's what made the bulletproof diet so famous. And I put coconut in the pulp, right, the fat with the fiber and everything, into my coffee in the morning. And if you omit the actual coconut milk, there's not a lot of sugar in it at all. And so that's a pretty darn good intermittent fasting keto food you can ingest. And I think the coffee tastes amazing with that coconut pulp. So chains get longer and longer and longer. And then if they don't get attached to triglycerides, which I've shown you before, you make lipids. So lipid is basically almost a triglyceride, but it usually only has 2 fatty acid chains. And then the third group is basically substituted with a lot of functional different groups. So these functional groups make up the world of lipids. Without the lipids, we wouldn't have anything. They make our cell membranes. Cell membranes control what goes in and out of the cell. They keep all the membrane proteins happy. And they basically are our world of functionality, lipid rafts, you name it. So again, lipids are a structural molecule. They're not usually used for energy, although they can be. And this third group in the triglyceride head here is modified. So in this case, it's phosphatidylcholine, which is attached to it. And all of these groups have different functions, but the point is that that end now becomes way more hydrophilic. What does that mean? It attracts water, right? So all these hydrophobic parts, the two fatty acid chains, get pushed inward by the forces of van der Waals and basic attraction of the water molecules on the outside. So they literally push the membrane together. So all the water likes the hydrophilic surface groups from the lipids, hangs out there. It can't go inside. So the inside of the membrane is hydrophobic or oil-like. And then you can have a micelle. We'll talk about a lot about that when we come to the bile action and so on. So yeah, so that's how a lipid looks like, and it's a structural molecule, and a triglyceride basically has 3 fatty acid chains. And then we have cardiolipin, which doubles up. You have 4 chains. It's a special lipid for our heart, which I already talked about. So again, the world of fats, triglycerides mostly for energy, and I will talk about what's actually involved in that. And then we have the fatty acids going from short fatty acids, butyric acid, to long chain stearic acid, and even longer ones, and now our omega-3s, omega-6, omega-9. And then we have all the lipids, and they all have different functions. Then we have cholesterol, and we have our bile salts, which are made from cholesterol, and we have our inflammatory and anti-inflammatory eicosanoids made from fat, and that's what rules our immune system. Cholesterol is not a fat, it's a steroid, and it does not enter the fat metabolism in the normal sense. It's not an energy molecule, it's a signaling hormonal molecule. And I talked a lot about vitamin D on my last talk, and 2 talks already, and how important it is to not overdose on vitamin D. And you can also understand that cholesterol makes very important steroid hormones, estrogen, etc. And also it makes the bile acids, which digest fat, and then cholesterol digests itself. So if you're cholesterol deficient, which can't really happen, but it does happen in vegans, you have a hard time digesting fat, and then you have a hard time digesting cholesterol, which is a vicious cycle in itself. So these are the steps of fat digestion, but this is talk so long now that I will put that off till the next time. Basically, you have to hydrolyze some of the fat. Very little of it gets digested in your mouth and stomach, because it really first has to be emulsified, and I'll explain how that all works and what that means. And then these emulsified micelles get absorbed into the intestinal mucosa, and then that whole spiel with chylomicrons and the lymphatic transport and circulation, fascinating topic. And we'll talk all about that the next time. So basically, this is how complicated it is. And I will go over this in detail the next time. But it's mostly actually about cholesterol. Most fat gets stored in the fat tissue, and that's where it's used for energy. So this will be very exciting next time. again, what is triglyceride? I already explained it to you. It's 3 chains of fatty acids, of which could be all 3 saturated, could be all 3 unsaturated. So the number 1 unsaturated molecule is omega-9. So it only has 1 bond at the 9th position, making a kink. And that is basically a fatty acid that you can make yourself if you don't ingest enough of it. So olive oil is mostly omega-9, but most plants don't really contain enough of it, so the body makes it itself. So again, you can have a mixture of all 3 of them or just all unsaturated. Everything is possible here, but omega-9 prevails. So that is oleic acid. Again, the length here, 18, with 1, N1 means 1 double bond, and it's at the 9th position. It's a monounsaturated fatty acid. So that is an excess of sometimes 55%. The reason is because it's a neutral fatty acid. It doesn't enter the immune system messaging. It has literally no meaning in terms of the rest of the body's functionality, other than keeping the membrane fluid. And it's easy to make. It's possible for us to introduce that double bond at number 9, where we are not able to induce the double bonds for EPA and DHA. We know that, and that's why they're essential. And that's why we're in trouble, right? So little side note here, again, stearic acid, very important for, especially for heart function. So all of these can be in different situations and different organs, completely different percentages. So in the retina, we have the highest DHA prevalence. So you can have all the way from 0.2 if you're highly deficient to 50%. The brain basically requires DHA, so it always will suck out DHA. So your eyes aren't that big, they don't have a lot of tissue. They're very high in DHA because the rhodopsin doesn't work without DHA, but it's absolute amounts. The brain really sucks out most of it. And then there's nothing left over for the rest of the body to combat inflammation. And that's what we see in most people. And then obviously heart needs a lot of EPA, and I already talked about that. So yeah, so the tissue amounts are very, very different in different organs and in different humans, different situations. So when we talk about our test result, we talk about RBC, red blood cell membranes, and they're not entirely the same as every organ. So obviously RBCs are made for gas exchange. That's what they do. They take up oxygen in the lung and then release CO2. So they're a little bit different membranes than normal cells. They are not nearly the same transporters, lipid rafts, and any of that. So, the content of omega-3 in the RBCs can vary tremendously compared to other organs. And so when your test keeps improving over 3 years, it's still a good mirror, an average mirror of all of your stem cells, taking in good omega-3 percentages. But it's not an absolute number by all means. So the cholesterol content matters tremendously, and it's very high in RBC membranes. I'll talk a lot more about cholesterol in a little bit. So yeah, so RBCs is what we test because it's easy, but ultimately we really want to test every organ, right? It's not quite possible. You can't take a biopsy of a brain just to test omega-3. So it's the best we have, and it's good enough. So fat storage is how we survive. And you can kind of imagine that there's a lot of energy in a fat molecule. When you have a 320 carbon fatty hydrocarbon chains in one molecule, it can hold a lot of energy. It's a very dense molecule, and that's how we survive. And it produces a lot of ATP energy carriers. And there are cells that literally just are fat, adipocytes, obviously. This whole bladder inside the cell here is just fat. You can see that here in the cross tissue. That is basically all fat storage because it is so important. And as I showed you all earlier, it's mostly all omega-9. I think I'll get to that again. So you can make energy from protein, but that's the last thing you want to do when you're starved away all of your fat. You start breaking down your protein, and that's not a good idea. Protein are structural and functional. Yeah, carbohydrates get burned quickly, and we know that glucose does make a fair amount of ATP, but it is definitely not a good source of energy. So, you know, the long-term batteries are always our fat, and there's different types of fat. There's good fat, bad fat. But you know, when your BMI goes too low, you're in trouble. You know, and basically, it's not entirely healthy to have a very low BMI. So yeah, palmitate, you know, C16 can make 106 ATPs. And that's called beta oxidation, versus glucose can only make 30. And that's only if you have aerobic capabilities. And for that, you need EPA and DHA. So if your mitochondria don't work, you cannot make this energy. And you are just doing the lactate cycle, which makes very, very little energy. But most people are overfed or undernourished, so you can definitely survive on glucose in an anaerobic state if you have enough of it. It's not healthy though, it's not how we were designed. So again, why omega-9? Because it has the most ideal melting point. So all the other fatty acids are either too cold or too hot. So obviously saturated fat only melts at about 60, 70 degrees. And our omega-3s melt very, very low temperatures, far below freezing. So omega-9 is the ideal 13-degree molecule. And that's why you have mostly omega-9 to keep your membranes in a most flexible and most ideal state. So they neither freeze or they neither melt. However, this whole thing is only possible, and I already talked about that, because cholesterol is a genius molecule. It's very short, sterile, inserted into the membrane, and it basically makes the membrane more flexible at lower temperatures and stiffer at higher temperatures. So that's exactly what you need to spread out your abilities to handle temperatures. Otherwise, we couldn't really survive in very hot or very cold climates. So cholesterol is far more important than omega-9 when it comes to membrane stability. However, omega-9 is far more important for storing fat. So again, membrane fatty acids vary tremendously, and arachidonic acid, omega-6, is most prevalent, up to 20%. So, you know, when you talk about dangerous lipid oxidation, that's a big topic out there. Oh, you can't take in too much omega-3 because you're going to oxidize it and then you're going to get all kinds of reactive oxygen species. Well, that doesn't really matter because most of it is omega-6 anyways. And we know massive access in most people anyway. So that's all discussed on my website too, if you have a problem with that issue. So here's the contribution of all of these saturated omega-3 and omega-6 in our membranes, and they're balanced. And that's really what you want. You want a 1-to-1 of 6 and 3, and you want to have kind of the same amount of saturated and kind of the same or more. Like I showed you, some cells have up to 50% omega-9 when you store energy. So again, this is what it looks like. Your phospholipid sticks in that membrane and it creates a charge on the outside, and the inside is hydrophobic. It gets pressed together, and the more flexible your fatty acid chain is, when we have DHA, it curls all the way around, the more fluid your membrane will be. But the cholesterol makes a huge difference. It floats inside this membrane. But without the lipids, you would not have a functional barrier. You would not have a living cell that controls everything, what goes in and out, transporters, receptors, channels. There's a lot that's going on in the membrane. And these lipids are very, very diverse, over 1,000 species. They have different compositions and different parts of organs and different organelles. So within the cell, there's a huge variation. So most prominent here is phosphatidylcholine, which I showed you earlier, I think. But it's much higher in the extracellular membrane than it is in the mitochondria. So all of these lipids have different functions, and they are signaling molecules too. They tell the neighbor cells, they tell viruses, bacteria, you name it, what to do. So there's a whole world, it's a whole talk in itself, very fascinating. Just I want to put that up, that you understand it's not something that is just like a lipid is a lipid. No, they can be extremely versatile. Yeah, and whole point on my website, challenging everybody, how much cholesterol do we have in our body right now? Absolute amounts, question mark. So the bilayer, as I just showed you, it's not basically static. The body continuously needs to adjust. So the inside of the layer, meaning the inside of the cell, pointing inside the cell, and there's a double layer, so they're different too within each other, have different amounts of fatty acids. So when your omega-3 gets incorporated into the membrane, there's actual enzymes called lipase, floppase, and scramblase. Crazy proteins sitting in the membrane that can flip and flop around these fatty acids, so they are actually going where they belong. So you want to have, if you want to, you can kind of imagine, if you want to create a negative curve, right? You definitely want to have more flexible fatty acids on the outside or inside or the bottom layer, and that's what these enzymes do. So very complex proposition here, but the main difference again here as a summary, what is fat? Triglycerides has literally no structural role. It's all about energy, very dense, and it gets stored in the adipocytes, but in any kind of organ can store it. And then our phospholipids that I just showed you have a structural role, and they create our membrane bilayers. Very minimal energy role, but they're heavily involved in omega-3 messaging. And so once the free fatty acids get released from the membrane, then you have your inflammatory or anti-inflammatory cascade, which I have already talked about in 4 parts. So yeah, this is the summary. Again, cholesterol, very important. It regulates membrane at higher and lower temperature. And brown versus white fat. Yeah, I mean, you can basically understand that, you know, the fatter you get, or the more unhealthy you get, the more metabolic syndrome you have because of your omega-3 deficiency. That's when, you know, this comes into play, but the body will naturally decide, you know, where it needs more brown versus white fat. And it's also, you know, basically a matter of how you move. If you are, you know, very sprint active, right, then you need more fast fat. When you're slow moving, you need more slow moving white fat. So that's basically what I have to say about that, but it's often in the discussion. But your body will naturally adjust that once your omega-3 levels are correct and you're not obese anymore and you're not at risk for metabolic syndrome. And what are obesity triggers? Obviously, it's omega-6, which is super rich in ultra-processed foods. I don't have to tell you that. And again, you know, many of the Asian countries, their intake of processed foods is enormous. If you just walk through the store, people say, you know, stay on the perimeter of the store, right? Anything inside is processed and will get you into a high omega-6 state. And then when they started, so when I grew up, you know, soda was made from beets, right? We have special sugar beets, and we actually retain all the minerals and, you know, the molasses. So it was still decent sugar. So, you know, I grew up on sugar sodas, but when they invented high fructose corn syrup, you know, that's no longer true. And so, you know, when you start reducing your protein, you've got a problem, and you're definitely replacing that with carbs. So it's actually really hard to have a vegetarian vegan diet with adequate amounts of protein. It's possible, but it's an uphill battle, but it's definitely possible. So in poor areas, you know, when you eat beans, right, they have higher amounts of protein. But, you know, anytime choose red meat if you can choose it. And if you have to survive, you know, plant protein will get you only so long. So triggers for obesity are definitely some genetic variants, but that's mostly an epigenetic issue. So kids of overweight parents tend to be fat, and so will their dogs be, and that's habits, and genes get turned on and off epigenetically. There are no real genes. Like I explained already in my autoimmunity, it's very, very, very rare to have a real dominant genetic mutation. Most of this is all epigenetic and omega-6, and that's how you develop metabolic syndrome and obesity. So fat doesn't make you fat. It's carbohydrates that make you fat, because they turn into fat in the context of high inflammatory situations, and high carb, low oxygen, anaerobic diets basically make fat. Body doesn't know what to do with it. After a while, you get insulin resistant, and then you basically don't use your carbs at all anymore, and then you turn fat, and then you turn obese. And all of that can be reversed. Once your pancreas gives up, especially when you start injecting insulin, then you're in trouble. You need insulin, there's no doubt. being on a keto diet forever is not a good idea. So eating a lot of fat gets you into a keto mode, and especially medium chain fatty acids spur all of that. And, that's all part of modern diets and intermittent fasting. So it's basically a very good trick. You tell your body you're fasting, but really you're just eating fat and protein. And, I was taught very early on fat makes you fat. So my parents were taught to stop eating fatty red meats. It's bad for you. It clogs your arteries. Cholesterol is bad for you. And all of that, again, I discussed, and it's on my website. Cholesterol is the second most important molecule after omega-3. So that is not true. And, we're learning that all. We're not believing the same narrative any more than our parents did. But I was just talking to my 96-year-old aunt. No, she's still got a jar of margarine in her fridge. So now that whole generation were taught to eat that. In any case, that is, coming to the end here very quickly before, I finish up with our outlook to next week. And there is healthy fat if it's subcutaneous. So the more internal the fat is, the more dangerous it gets. So, sumo wrestlers have a lot of subcutaneous fat. They need it for their sport, and they still have very healthy hearts. So if you store your fat in outer layers, it's protective. Swimmers usually have a lot of subcutaneous fat, and anything more internal puts you at much higher risk. And it's not the fat itself that puts you at risk, right? It's just the side effect. So then you get to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And is it dangerous? Most of the time, we just kind of ignore it, but yes, it can be dangerous. So even just more than 5% of fat accumulation in your liver. I mean, we know that alcohol destroys your liver. There's no question here. And cirrhosis develops, at chronic alcohol intake, but it has to be significant alcohol intake. But this is different, right? So, a fatty liver for most people is not really dangerous, but in the context of very high omega-6 and none of your detox enzymes work anymore, your liver actually becomes scarred too. So you can develop cirrhosis from non-alcoholic fatty acid liver disease. So that's basically what I have to say about that. And you should keep an eye on it. So omega-3 is obviously the solution to non-alcoholic fatty liver, and the reason is very simple. All metabolic syndrome goes away when you have proper omega-3. The main thing I look in a blood work is triglycerides. So you have high triglyceride, that means you're on the way to pre-diabetic metabolic syndrome. You have low triglycerides, you basically are kind of safe. And when you have adequate amounts of omega-3, the triglycerides go down to the 30s. So, that's where you look at in your blood work. None of the other blood work actually matters. You look at your triglycerides and figure out, that's basically 30 and good. However, most people are at 120, 150, right? So then you have a sign of diabetes. And so this is all regulated by omega-3 through inflammation and transporters and and liver function. So that's why, you know, basically your omega-6 to 3 ratio is the most important step if you have non-alcoholic liver disease. Yeah, so that's where I'm going to end today. You know, fascinating topic of lipids and dairy and short chain, medium chain fatty acids. And next week, I'm going to talk about how we actually digest the fat, even more fascinating topic, and how we have a trick here with our pre-dissolved omega-3, and it works a lot faster, and I'm going to explain you why that is really an issue. So yeah, thanks very much for listening to this talk today, which is a little bit long, but I'm going to stop the recording, and if there's any questions, you can definitely ask them now.